just a couple of things. Obviously, we have two wonderful policymakers. Something that comes up for me is that historically, um, when we had any number of organizations, whether it be the Black Teachers Association from back in the day, or any number of associations or unions and such, they always tried to bring in policymakers because we wanted to ensure that it's not just for accountability, but also for changing the world and trying to find ways to do it through whichever avenue. So I have the fortunate and the honor to uh, not just introduce one person who I'm sure many are familiar with. That would be Dr. Miguel Cardona, who's going to be speaking to us live from Washington, D.C., giving us a few remarks around the work that we must do, and of course, and pouring into ourselves. But also, we have the honor and pleasure of also having Helen Gym, who I've known since I feel like the last 12, 13 years. Just somebody who really cares about students, cares about communities, cares about Philadelphia, but also the nation writ large. Our activism around the standardized testing also intersected with the ways that schools were reconfigured, privatized, and all that other nonsense that was happening to our schools. And so, well, you're going to hear from Miguel Cardona first, who will then pass the mic over to Helen Gim. So here goes nothing.
Jose, and thanks to all the educators here. Opportunities like this summit are so meaningful. Especially now, as we recover from the challenges of the last 2 years, we must ground our work in what matters the most, the students we serve. Summer is a time when educators recharge and relax a little bit and take care of themselves, but they're also planning for the next year. In preparing to share a few words with you, I reflected on the theme of your summit. I asked myself, how do we as educators pour into ourselves and prepare for the important work ahead, even while we pour all we have into our kids? And to answer that question, I focused on who we are as educators of color and why we came into this work. For me, it brings me back to a moment I had in 7th grade. Imagine this. Throughout school, up until 7th grade, all my teachers referred to me as Michael. Nowhere else did anyone else call me Michael. It was only at school. Even though my birth certificate says Miguel Angel Cardona. At the age of 12, when I was in 7th grade, I asked my mom, I said, Mommy, why do they call me Michael? We talked about it a little bit, and then we came to the conclusion that we didn't understand why they called me Michael and not Miguel. I felt empowered that day, and I just kind of felt it was important for me to do something about it. So the next day I walked into the school office, and I asked the clerical staff there to change everything on my paperwork to Miguel. I'll never forget that experience because I was affirming my identity and being proud. I wanted to acknowledge the name that my parents chose for me, and I felt that it was time that I spoke up about it. As educators of color, each day we proudly bring our authentic, whole selves to our work. We recognize the important role we play in ensuring that all students see educators and leaders of color. Embracing our biculturalism, which I often call our superpower, is what we do to inspire our students. In so many ways, we are what our students aspire to be. Who we are at our very core gives us strength to keep going, even when times are tough. And I know with the recent tragedy in Uvalde and with politics trying to creep into our classrooms, things can feel really heavy. But our work to support our students matters more than ever. This is our moment to double down on putting the well-being of our students at the heart of all we do. I'm proud that this administration is working to help ensure school communities are safe. We've made a step in the right direction with the President signing the Safer Communities Act. And I'm grateful for those in Congress who had the courage to take meaningful action. This bipartisan bill provides billions in funding to support safe and healthy students, to hire school-based health professionals, and to strengthen the pipeline into the school-based health profession. This is also our moment to uplift the teaching profession. At the Department of Education, we're here to support you with policies and efforts grounded in the vital role we know educators play for our kids and for our communities. Elevating our profession will require that we continue to invest in a diverse educator workforce through things like teacher preparation programs at historically black colleges and universities, at minority serving institutions, at tribal colleges. It means high quality teacher residencies. It means apprenticeship programs and grow your own programs. We also need a renewed focus on compensation and ensuring teachers are paid a livable, competitive wage. Name another profession where people with master's degree have to work another job to make ends meet. We also have to make it affordable to be a teacher. That means tackling student loan debt. I'm proud that in our first year we made significant changes to the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. Now, more than 127,000 public servants, including educators, have gotten debt relief. Don't forget to apply by October 31st. You can use this benefit for teacher loan forgiveness too. We've also made changes to improve the Teach Grant to make sure our most underserved students have access to excellent teachers. This is our moment to pour into us because we recognize the foundational work and the incredible potential of our students. Our diversity is our greatest strength. Thank you for all you do and for your commitment to our students. And now I'll turn it over to Philadelphia Councilwoman Helen Gym.
Good evening, everybody. Jose, EduColor friends and colleagues, I cannot tell you what an incredible honor it is to join you here tonight and to thank you for giving us hope and community in these times. You know, to see EduColor grow, not only in membership, but in urgency and mission speaks volumes to the transformative vision of EduColor's founders and to the extraordinary work you have done to build a community that honors and invests in Black, POC, diverse leadership and voice. And most of all, amidst, the madness of this world, thank you for holding space for us to restore our sense of sanity and humanity and love for one another and ourselves. So I'm so honored to join you here today and to bring you greetings from Philly, also known as the hometown featured in the happiest half hour on TV. So step aside Creed and Rocky Balboa. You can move over Denzel and J-Law. I'm obviously talking about Quinta Brunson's Abbott Elementary. Claps all around. If you want to know the complicated, hot, lovable mess that is my beloved Philadelphia, just know this. We are as chaotically charismatic as Ava, as cringy eager as Jacob, as if you cross us, I know a guy, defensive as Melissa Sheminati, as drop dead glamorous an entrance maker as the Mrs. Barbara Howard, and as determined, persistent, compassionate, dedicated, and frustrated as our hero, Janine. What I love most about Abbott Elementary is that it never shies away from the struggle. The underfunding, the flickering lights, the busted technology, pendulum swings of leadership that is a Philadelphia public school. And because of that, it reminds us that a community that comes together wins together. It's a celebration of resilience and growth rooted in the relationships, trust, and investment of people who are united in a common mission to uplift our children and families. Abbott Elementary is a joyous Philadelphia. It's a feminist Philadelphia. It is a Black and beautiful Philadelphia. It is a hopeful Philadelphia. And I hope that my remarks come to you in that spirit tonight. Today, as we face some of the greatest threats to our democracy and Constitution, I see our future in the actions of everyday people who take to the streets to support their public schools and teachers, young people organizing for climate justice, returning citizens working for reform of the criminal justice system, single moms and veterans demanding a right to housing, and workers who are winning unions and better jobs for all. This spirit lives in the millions of people who have marched for reproductive justice, for gender equality, for Black lives, and against AAPI hate, to defend immigrant rights, and to end gun violence. And this isn't just something that we feel. It's something that I feel that, that I've lived. My roots are very deep in Philadelphia's Asian American and immigrant communities. Before I ever got onto City Council, I cut my teeth for more than 2 decades fighting mayors and developers who would take Chinatown land from boondoggles like publicly funded baseball stadiums and casinos. I spent 20 years in a small Chinatown nonprofit called Asian Americans United, surrounded by a matriarchy of courageous women whose experiences span not just decades, but American history. They have been part of the civil rights movement as members of SNCC. They helped launch the battle for ethnic studies. They were at the very beginnings of the LGBTQ movement. They turned decrepit housing into federally subsidized affordable rentals and built public schools worthy of our children. And they did it as a group of loudmouth, bawdy, sometimes foul-mouthed storytellers, artists, and historians who completely changed my view of what it meant to be Asian in America. Those of us with immigrant roots know that home, family, and community is what we build on this land. And when those very things have been taken away from you by war, by violence, forced relocation, market, and environmental disasters, they become more precious than ever. When everything in the world tried to erase our existence, our language, our culture, and our history, what I learned from Asian Americans United was that the things the world scorned were, as Secretary Cardona said, our powers, our superpowers, our ability to connect across generations, to reclaim art forms long exotified and traditions long forgotten. When we were pushed out of halls of power, we built our own power centers. We held space in vacant lots and schoolyards, on Chinatown street corners, where we learned to listen, to heal, and to dream. And out of that, AU taught me not just how to build, but why we build. Gardens that can fill once vacant lots, traditional art festivals that fill our streets, youth programs that mentor generations, a school that would deliver the kind of education deserving of our kids. This is how we called a general strike of all the businesses in Chinatown, for example, to stop a casino from being built, or organized a boycott of a high school where immigrant youth were being physically beaten and assaulted. This is how we built a new school on Chinatown land once designated for that baseball stadium. A colleague of mine put it this way: communities of memory and place are the heart and soul of cities like Philadelphia. When you see protesting, this is why we fight, because we keep our love for a place, for a community intact. When we do so, we become part of a much broader global movement, prioritizing the local, treasuring our relationships, and recommitting to our collective responsibilities as a people who care about their home and their city. What I knew was that when the dragons danced, when the drums thundered, when the colorful flags streamed above us as we marched, this is how we filled the streets with our voice, our vision, and our power. Our motto was, you only get what you are organized to take. So organize we did. My politics and policies come out of a broad movement for justice and reparations like this. And for me, nothing was more powerful than the children, families, educators, staff, and communities who came together to fight for equitable and quality public schools for all in this city. Together, we fought off a 2-decade-long state takeover that stripped our schools of resources, that busted unions, over-tested, funneled kindergartners into a school-to-prison pipeline, and finally culminated in mass school closings and the losses of thousands of teachers and staff. In the face of so much inhumanity, we had to build something different. And we knew something else was possible. A coalition that could labor for years, centering the voices of our youth, of Black and Brown and immigrant communities, of poor and working people across the city, which could build a vision for Philadelphia that was bigger, broader, and more unifying than anything that had ever come out of City Hall before. We spent decades building trust and breaking down barriers of sexism, patriarchy, homophobia, of anti-Blackness, anti-immigrant, and anti-trans hate that so often destroys movements from within. We showed up for one another. We knew that the forces that shut down our schools are the same forces that profit from private prisons and mass incarceration, cut taxes for the wealthy, exploit workers, and steal our healthcare. And today, I'm on City Council because of that organizing. And I hope I am bringing the same spirit of healing, restoration, and a fierce amount of protection to my beloved and deeply complicated city. On council, I want to talk about what it means to deliver a human rights agenda and ensure that the path to achieving it centers people and community voice. Here in the poorest big city in the United States, more than 1 in 4 Philadelphians lives in poverty, and almost 40% of our children are born into it. This poverty is literally a matter of life and death. We have a 20-year life expectancy difference between zip codes half a mile apart. And we know that poverty and inequality on this scale, they don't happen by accident. It happens when we allow that poverty to become inevitable, when we allow public policy to be driven by private profit rather than the public good. And because of that, my job has never been to reflect the political winds, but to change them. You know, when I first came into City Council in 2016, Philadelphia schools remained under state takeover. Austerity was in play, and the leadership at the district was the same as the one that closed down 30 public schools and eliminated thousands of positions, leaving our schools devoid of nurses and counselors and so much more. But if we believe that a politics of the people starts with the people, then start with them you do. That spring, we conducted school town halls all across the city of Philadelphia to center the voices of thousands of residents who came out to talk about their children and the schools they deserved, and to decenter the authority of a state takeover body hell-bent on doing the opposite. And that's how we restored nurses and counselors to every public school, how we then were able to guarantee music programs, social workers, and we kickstarted a clean water campaign that would lead to one of the first school modernization efforts in years. And I just want to take a moment to talk about what that means, because part of this work and part of the transformation and unification when teachers and activists come into public office is that we have to show how different it is. One of the first bills I introduced into council was in response to the horrors of what had happened in Flint, Michigan in 2014, when thousands of people were severely poisoned because the city failed to treat corrosive water flooding through residential lead pipes. In a city like Philadelphia, an old and aging city that failed to invest in infrastructure for the people, I vowed that it would never happen, but you just can't say those words. You have to make sure that they don't. Do you know who my partners were actually in that first legislative campaign? We made sure it were middle schoolers. I made sure that those school town halls that I talked about earlier included students as young as 9 and 10 years old who presented before a school board and city council members at our city council hearings, speaking about the miserable quality of water in their schools or the limited access to it. Joining with these students across the district, we helped win a very modest $1 million investment by the district to install modern filtered hydration stations into every public school. It was at even that small amount, one of the first citywide modernization efforts in the public school district in years. And then we passed legislation to require annual testing of water in our public schools, daycare centers, and in all rental units. This work wasn't just necessary, it was actually loved. We heard from students from kindergarten to high school about what it felt to actually have something new in their schools. The work kicked off the district's Green Schools effort, and today we're on a path towards school modernization. We've worked to bring air conditioning in this incredibly hot weather to dozens of public schools across the city to remediate lead, asbestos, and mold. We actually won a small pilot from the University of Pennsylvania, and we're here for more. These are the first improvements after years of disinvestment. And this year, I passed legislation to finish the job and will require every single school to have fully filtered hydration stations. Within 3 years, we will have completely eliminated lead from the drinking water in every public and charter school. One of the myths about being in office is somehow the forces that opposed your entry into office will suddenly magically disappear and a magic wand will appear in your hand. And I'm here to tell you, no, that is definitely not the case. Now, I also had a city council body where the chair of the housing committee was the self-declared condo king of Center City, one of the city's largest landlords. Developers and real estate interests were one of the largest contributors in lobbying groups to our body, and they still are. Now, I've never done anything because the politics are with us. Everything that we do, when we have a chance to do it, must be to change the monstrosity of politics that dehumanizes all of us. A politics of humanity always starts with people first. And if we're ever to have hope of changing laws, we have to change the mindset of how evictions impact people. We had to change the idea that evictions are merely a private legal matter between a landlord and lessee, that evictions were a contract to be decided in a courtroom. And we had to make clear that it was a matter of public interest. So we started our work with town halls in partnership with community organizations. We didn't call policy experts to the table. We talked to teachers who did lose their students. We talked to church and family members who picked up the pieces. We uplifted the voices of residents, trying to remind people that something this prevalent, this inhumane, was not simply a problem with individuals. It was a problem about us. All of us had a problem when we were one of the highest evicting cities in the country. All of us have a problem when we showed that evictions threw children out of their schools, seniors out of their homes, and single moms out onto the streets. And before we were ever able to step forward and make massive policy changes, to enact tenant legal defense funds, which eventually grew into a civil right to council, to enact local eviction moratoriums, to establish a groundbreaking eviction diversion program, we had to start with those who are most impacted. I recall at the announcement of our law establishing a civil right to counsel, guaranteeing lawyers for tenants who couldn't afford one. One mother explained what it felt like to take a day off of work, to find childcare since children are prohibited in our municipal courtrooms, and that, yes, is actually a thing, and to walk into landlord-tenant court. She said that when she walked in, a wall of lawyers filled one side of the courtroom, and she said she knew that not a single one of them was on her side. So we won a civil right to counsel, thanks to her, guaranteeing that every tenant, no matter their income, would have a lawyer beside them in landlord-tenant court. And I say all that because fundamentally collaborative governance is about humanizing our experiences and our people and our communities and our issues. And so we have to bring humanity back into inhumane situations. And that starts first with the on-the-ground organizing spaces where people can be heard. My staff are organizers, they're event planners, they're information distributors, and they're media liaisons before they're ever policy experts. Some people who come from the outside like to say that they're not political, but pardon my language, that is BS. Our lives are political, and they are politicized each and every day. And I've never shied away from the fact that it is our responsibility to be political, to make the people that we love be seen in their fullest light, to make voices heard, and to have issues be better understood and even embraced than they ever were before. And of course, it doesn't mean that legislation, policies, things that we talk about at the national level, whether we're talking about education or housing or food access or tax equity, that of course that those don't matter. Good policies absolutely make a difference. We need an arsenal of them to do something different that hasn't been done before. We simply cannot reach for the same old tools that people 20 years ago tried and weren't able to accomplish. We have to refresh, we have to rebrand, and then we have to bring in these new ideas with a new energized effort. But the difference between that approach and the way so many people who are on focus around policy go about this is that we cannot start with policy. No policy has ever been received or rejected because it was smart, it was fair, or it was economically sane. Policies are embraced when they become impossible for us to look away, when they become impossible for us to walk away from. And today, Philadelphia's eviction rate is less than a third of what it was when we started in 2016. We've distributed more than $250 million to 40,000 households during the pandemic to keep people housed. And this year, my colleagues introduced, not me, my colleagues introduced a bill for rent stabilization for vulnerable populations. In the words of Arundhati Roy, once you see something, you can't ever unsee it. And once you've seen it, keeping quiet, saying nothing becomes as political an act as speaking out. There is no innocence. So there are other things that I would love to share with you. I would love to talk about how we closed down these horrible abusive centers which detained and housed at-risk youth, how we won historic labor rights for domestic workers and non-unionized staff, and how we led campaigns for trans and non-binary youth, how we dramatically expanded the city's non-discrimination laws, even as our state legislature began to restrict them. But in the time that I've left, I just wanted to hold space for a critical component of the politics of humanity, and that's the power of apology. In my first year in office, there was a customary honoring of Jackie Robinson Day. It's like a national holiday in sports history, but this time I wanted our resolution to be different. We made it an apology to Jackie Robinson, to his widows, to his family members, to the public, and to history for the racism and violence that Jackie Robinson experienced when he played in Philadelphia, which he often described as among the most brutal and vicious of his career. It seems simple enough. And oftentimes honorary resolutions get absolutely no attention because they just are simple, basic honorary practice enacted dozens of times over and over again. But not this one. This one drew the attention of Jackie Robinson's family. It drew the attention of historians like Ken Burns, the front pages of news. It reignited a conversation within the Phillies themselves when they were asked if they supported the council resolution. And they did. My favorite moment, though, was speaking about history and apology at a Little League center amid elders and children as we discussed and debated the power of holding space for acceptance of past wrongs, for atonement, for forgiveness, acknowledgement, and healing. In 2020, the George Floyd protests for justice swept through Philadelphia as it did all across the nation, resulting in the largest demonstrations in history in our city. It also resulted in the horrific nationally televised tear gassing of innocent and constitutionally protected protesters in West Philadelphia and on the Vine Street Expressway. This tear gassing had traumatic history. In 1985, the city of Philadelphia tear gassed and then bombed the Move complex on Osage Avenue in West Philadelphia. 11 people were murdered, including 5 children. Dozens of children were dislocated, and the city failed to apologize. The November after the George Floyd protests, amid hearings and public calls for accountability, my colleague Jamie Gauthier, who is a brand new freshman council member and representing the West Philadelphia area, organized a formal apology from the city on the 35th anniversary of Move. She wrote, "There are echoes of the Move bombing that persist in Philadelphia's police-community relations, historical discrimination against people of color, and unnecessary use of force that has shaped a culture of distrust between police and residents. And whereas the uprisings in Philadelphia and across the country in the wake of the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, David Jones, and other Black and brown people killed by the police reflects a reckoning within our country's past and the institutional racism and societal inequality that exists today. And whereas in order to evolve and progress towards a more just and equal society, we must confront, reflect upon, and learn from heinous government actions of the past. And whereas the Council of the City of Philadelphia hereby establishes an annual day of observation, reflection, and recommitment on May 13th in order to remember the devastation of May 13th, 1985, and to heal the wounds created on this day and to prevent similar occurrences from ever happening again. We issued that apology. And from the moment I have ever stepped into office, and whether we were in office or not, we have to be relentless in making sure that not 1 second is ever taken for granted. What we lost yesterday is the driving force for the urgency of today, and a reminder that we must assume bold and fearless leadership whenever we have the chance to make change. So what does all this mean for this moment that we're in? I'm the co-chair of Local Progress, a national network of 1,400 municipal elected officials across 750 jurisdictions, bringing a racial and economic justice agenda alive through the work of city services, local policy that energizes when state legislatures go wrong or federal policies stagnate, and a chance to build a vision from the ground up. We believe that when they go low, we go local. We go local because our politics are so closely connected to our communities on the ground. We go local because we cannot wait for Congress or state legislatures or the courts to save us. We go local because this is how we show that we can and we must win for our people. Our schools crisis that I spoke about earlier had its roots in a long and intertwined history of capitalism and racism that perpetuated a 17-year state takeover of public schools and promoted a corporate reform agenda that pushed privatization, union busing, attacks on teachers, and defunded and closed down schools. But we see those same forces in play today in the coordinated and funded attacks on pedagogy, on book burnings, and the recalls of school board members. These are not political swings of the moment. The things that they want to do to us only become possible when fundamental institutions are eroded and democracy itself is at risk. So what we learn from all of this is that our roots, whether they're in immigrant communities, in education justice communities, in communities of color, in educolor, is that in times of injustice, our politics have never, ever started with politicians. They've always started with us. We who have been the survivors of occupation and war and enslavement. We who have understood the pain and injustice of divided nations and families. We're an unbowed and unbroken community. And we're people who have defied unjust laws and thus defined justice and human rights for all, whose ancestors call us to action in this moment and remind us what it means to push beyond our boundaries and to build a better world for one another and for our children. This is not a Philadelphia story. This is not an education story. This is not an immigrant story. This is a story and a path to rebuild a fragile and hurt nation. I want to thank everybody at Educolor for your tremendous work that you do every day, for building the types of communities that make people like me even possible in political life. I want to hold each other close and continue the work ahead. And I look forward to all the things that we can do together.
Woo! Fire.